There is a particular kind of exhaustion that only people who grew up in certain families will recognize. It isn't the exhaustion of overwork or illness or grief, though it resembles all of those things in passing. It is the exhaustion of a lifetime spent managing someone else's emotional weather, of waking up every morning and checking, before you have even fully surfaced from sleep, what mood the house is in, of learning, before you learned most other things, that your job was to keep the temperature stable, to smooth, to soothe, to shrink yourself into whatever shape caused the least disruption. That was my childhood. And for most of my adult life, it was my adulthood too. My mother is a woman of extraordinary presence. I want to say that without irony, because it is genuinely true. She is the kind of person who fills a room completely, loud in the way that commands attention, warm in the way that makes you feel chosen when you are on the receiving end of her approval, and devastating in the way that only people who know how to give warmth can be when they take it away. She had a gift for both. She spent my entire childhood oscillating between the two, and I spent my entire childhood learning to read the oscillation, to anticipate it, to position myself on the right side of it. My father was softer, quieter, not weak, but conflict-averse in a way that meant he had long ago learned to orbit my mother's gravity rather than resist it. He loved me, I believe, genuinely and without condition, but his love was mostly private. In the moments that mattered, in the confrontations and the ultimatums, and the scenes that my mother orchestrated with the confidence of someone who had never once lost a family argument, he was not in the room. Or rather, he was in the room, but he was not present in the way that could have helped. My brother, who is 4 years older than me, had made his peace with the family dynamic in the way that eldest children sometimes do, by becoming an extension of my mother's worldview rather than a separate person within it. He did not do this cynically. I don't think he was even conscious of it. But the effect was that growing up, the ratio was always 3-to-1 when things went sideways, and the one was always me. I was the difficult one. I want to be precise about what that word meant in our family because it did not mean what it would mean to an outside observer. I was not defiant or destructive or cruel. I was, by any objective measure, a good child, responsible, academically capable, genuinely loving toward my family, even when that love was not returned in kind. What made me difficult in my mother's taxonomy was that I had opinions, that I expressed them, that I could not be made to feel wrong about things I knew to be right simply by being told loudly and repeatedly that I was wrong, that I would not apologize for things I had not done. This was, to her, a fundamental character flaw. The pattern of our relationship as I moved into adulthood followed the same rhythm it always had, just with higher stakes and longer silences. There would be a period of relative warmth, calls, family dinners, the ordinary texture of a family that was functioning in its way, and then something would happen. A disagreement about my choices. A comment I didn't receive the way it was intended, or perhaps received exactly the way it was intended and refused to accept. A boundary I drew that she experienced as a personal rejection. And then would come the withdrawal, the cold period. Sometimes days, sometimes weeks. The silence designed to make me come crawling back, to make me understand that her approval was a resource I could not afford to be cut off from. For most of my life, it worked. I would endure the silence for as long as I could stand it, and then I would reach out. I would soften my position, not because I had changed my mind, but because the cost of the standoff was higher than the cost of the concession. I would apologize, sometimes for things that warranted apology, and sometimes for things that absolutely did not. And she would receive the apology with a warmth that felt like sunlight coming back out after a storm, and we would resume, and I would carry the concession quietly and tell myself it was the price of family. I did this for years. More years than I want to count. And each time I did it, something in me grew a little more tired, a little more distant from myself, a little more certain that there would come a moment when I simply could not do it again. That moment came on a Tuesday in February. The argument that preceded the text was not, by the standards of our history, a particularly extraordinary one. That is the thing I keep returning to. It was not a blowout, not a confrontation that had been building toward an inevitable explosion. It was, in the landscape of my family's communication, a fairly ordinary disagreement, which tells you something important about what ordinary looked like for us. My mother had made a decision about a family matter that affected me directly, without consulting me. It was not the first time she had done this. It was not even close to the first time. But this time I had said so. I had told her, as calmly and directly as I was capable of managing, that I needed to be included in decisions that affected my life. That doing things on my behalf without my knowledge or consent was not consideration, it was control. And that I loved her and I wanted a relationship with her, but that relationship needed to work differently than it had been working. She did not respond well. She escalated in the way she always escalated, first to louder, then to cold, then to the particular and well-practiced speech about everything she had done for me and how little she was being shown in return. My father said nothing. My brother texted me afterward to tell me I had been out of line. I told him, also calmly, that I disagreed and that I would talk to him properly when I was ready. 2 hours after I got off the phone with my mother, the text arrived. I was in my kitchen making dinner, and my phone was on the counter, and it lit up, and I picked it up without any particular premonition, and I read it. After the way you've spoken to me today, I think it's best you don't contact any of us again. We need space from you. I put the phone back down on the counter. I turned back to the stove. I stood there for a full minute not moving, the food going quietly in the pan, and I experienced something that surprised me with its clarity. I was not devastated. I was not immediately bereft. I was not even, in that first moment, particularly angry. What I felt, standing in my kitchen on a Tuesday in February, reading the text in which my mother told me not to contact my family again, was a profound and terrible calm. Because here is what I knew, in that calm, with a certainty I had been approaching for years and had now finally arrived at completely. She expected me to respond within the hour. She expected a message of apology and distress, the familiar concession, the pattern we had been performing together for decades. She had sent that text not as a genuine severing but as a lever, the biggest lever in her inventory, the nuclear option she kept for the moments when smaller pressures hadn't worked. She had deployed it before in softer versions. This was the clearest version, the most unambiguous. And she had deployed it fully confident that it would work. I stood in my kitchen, and I made a decision. Not impulsively. Not from a place of anger or wounded pride. From the quietest, most grounded place inside myself, a place that I had been slowly excavating my way back to for the past few years through therapy and hard conversations with myself and the gradual accumulation of self-knowledge that comes from deciding, inch by inch, that your own experience is real and worth protecting. I decided not to respond. Not that evening. Not the next morning. Not with an apology or a defense or a request for clarification. I decided to honor what she had asked for completely and without performance, to give my family the space they had said they needed, and to find out what I was like in that space. I put my phone in the other room, and I finished making dinner, and I sat at my table alone and I ate, and I tried to locate in my body the grief I expected to find there. I found some of it. It was real, and it was present, and I did not dismiss it. But underneath it was something else, something I had not expected, something I almost didn't have a word for. It felt like ground. Solid ground, beneath my feet, for the first time in a very long time. The first week of not reaching out was the hardest. I want to be honest about that because there is a version of this story that makes the decision sound easy, clean, righteous, the obvious and correct thing to do. And intellectually it was. Emotionally, it was one of the harder things I have ever done because the habit of reaching out was so deeply wired in me that its absence felt physically strange, like learning to walk without using a muscle you had always used without thinking. I kept picking up my phone and putting it back down. Not because I wanted to apologize, I still did not. But because the pull toward connection, even connection that costs you, is extraordinarily powerful when the people on the other side of it are your parents. We are built, at the most fundamental level, to want to be okay with the people who made us. That wiring does not care whether the relationship is healthy. It predates all of your adult reasoning by decades. It lives in the body in a way that the mind cannot simply override with a decision, no matter how sound that decision is. I talked to my therapist twice that week. I talked to my closest friend, who had witnessed enough of my family's dynamics over the years to understand the territory without needing a map. What both conversations reinforced was the same thing. Wait. Not forever. Not with the intention of permanent estrangement as the goal. But wait long enough to let the pattern break. Long enough to see what happened when I didn't do the thing I had always done. Long enough to find out whether the relationship could reconfigure itself into something different if I stopped holding up my side of the old structure. What the silence revealed was both harder and more clarifying than I had anticipated. The hard part was the grief. Real, sustained grief for the family I had needed and had never quite had. Not grief for the family as it actually was, but grief for the one I had kept hoping it might become. For the version of my mother where her love didn't come with conditions attached. For the version of my father where he would occasionally stand beside me when standing was required. For the version of my brother where we were genuinely close rather than playing assigned roles in a family script. That grief was not new. I had been carrying it for years, but the silence gave it room to move through me in a way it never had when I was busy managing and appeasing and maintaining. The clarifying part was discovering what my life felt like without the constant background noise of managing the family dynamic. I had not realized, until it was absent, how much of my mental and emotional bandwidth had been perpetually allocated to that management. How often I had edited myself before calling home, calibrating what I said, and how I said it to minimize the chances of setting something off. How much of my emotional energy had been spent on the recovery after difficult interactions, on processing what had been said, on talking myself out of the hurt and back into a functional state so I could continue with my actual life. Without all of that, I had so much more of myself available. The quiet was uncomfortable at first, and then it was a revelation. I slept differently. I noticed things I had stopped noticing. I had conversations with people that went deep and stayed there, unconstrained by the part of my mind that had always been partially elsewhere, partially back in the family drama, partially managing. I was 3 weeks into the silence when the calls began. The first call came on a Friday evening. It was my mother's number, and I watched the phone ring, and I did not answer it, and I felt the strange doubling of guilt and steadiness that I was becoming familiar with, the guilt rising, the steadiness beneath it holding. She didn't leave a voicemail. That was notable. If the call had been genuine, uncalculated, if she had simply wanted to talk, she would have left a message. The absence of a message told me the call was something else. It was a probe, a test of whether I would pick up, of whether the silence had softened me to the point of accessibility. I did not call back. The second call came the next morning. Then 2 more that afternoon. My father called once, which was unusual enough in itself that it landed with particular weight. My father, who so rarely made unilateral contact, now being deployed in this. I did not answer. I texted him, briefly, to say that I was okay, that I needed some time, and that I would reach out when I was ready. He did not respond to the text. The calls escalated through the following week in a way that had a rhythm to it, not random, but patterned, like pressure being applied with increasing deliberateness. Mornings, evenings, clusters of calls close together followed by gaps, then another cluster. My brother began calling too, and his calls had a different quality, less emotional, more managerial, the tone of someone who had been tasked with resolving a situation and was applying his customary efficiency to the job. He left voicemails. I listened to them, but did not return them. They followed a familiar arc, the first one reasonable and measured, asking me to call back so we could talk this through as a family. The second one slightly edged, a note of impatience beneath the reasonableness. The third one abandoning the pretense of neutrality, telling me that my behavior was hurting our parents and that I needed to think about what I was doing. I thought about what I was doing. I thought about it continuously and with complete seriousness. I was not ignoring the calls from a place of vindictiveness or score settling. I was not doing it to cause pain or to prove a point. I was doing it because every time I felt the pull to pick up, I asked myself the same question. What will have changed? What will be different about the conversation that happens now compared to every conversation that has happened before? And I could not locate an honest answer to that question that justified breaking the pattern I was finally, after decades, holding. By the end of 3 weeks, the count had reached 58 missed calls across the 3 of them. 58. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because I think it says something important about the nature of control masquerading as love. The same woman who had told me not to contact any of them again had called me 58 times. There is a dissonance in that which I think is worth examining, because it illuminates something true about how certain family dynamics operate. The "don't contact us" was not an expression of genuine need for distance. It was an expectation of capitulation. It was an ultimatum built on the assumption that I would not be able to hold the boundary it established, that I would come running back within days, probably hours, and that the message would serve its purpose of reminding me how much I needed them and how little I should push back. When I did not come running, when the silence stretched from hours to days to weeks, the framework broke. The leverage it was supposed to apply failed to move me. And what replaced the ultimatum was panic. 58 calls was not love. It was not remorse. It was the sound of a dynamic losing its footing. I held the line. I want to be clear about what that cost, because I am not a person without feeling, and the 40-second missed call landed differently than the second one. There were evenings when I held my phone and felt the weight of everything it represented: my parents, my childhood, the version of family I had always wanted this one to be, and I grieved it, genuinely and without shortcut. There were nights when the steadiness faltered, and I came close to calling back just to make the noise stop, just to feel like less of a person who had abandoned her family on principle. What stopped me, each time, was a memory. Not a dramatic one. A small one. A specific evening from about 2 years earlier, when I had tried, carefully and lovingly, to tell my mother that something she had said had hurt me. Her response had been immediate and total: to turn the hurt around, to make my pain evidence of my own oversensitivity, to extract from me, within the hour, an apology for having been hurt. I remembered sitting on my bathroom floor after that call, forehead against the cool tile, exhausted in my soul, and thinking, I cannot keep doing this, and then getting up and doing it again. That memory held me steady through 58 calls. Because I knew, with a certainty that the calls themselves only confirmed, that answering would return me to that bathroom floor. After the 58th call, there was a silence from their side that lasted 11 days. I experienced those 11 days as a kind of atmospheric pressure change, the abrupt stillness after a storm that is either the end of the storm or the eye of it, and you don't know which until more time has passed. On the 12th day, a letter arrived. Physical, handwritten, in my mother's script. I held it for a long time before opening it. It was not an apology. I want to be honest about that, because the satisfying version of the story would have it be an apology, a full and genuine accounting of the pattern, an acknowledgement of the cost, a request for a different kind of relationship going forward. It was not that. It was something more complicated, which is to say, it was something more true to who my mother actually is. It was a letter that expressed hurt at my absence, that described the calls as evidence of how much she loved me, how desperate they had been to hear from me, how frightened my silence had made them. It said she wanted things to be better. It said she missed me. It said she hoped I would come home. It did not say, I understand why you needed this. It did not say, I see the pattern and I want to change it. It did not say, the text I sent was wrong. The ultimatum was a cruelty dressed as a boundary, and you owed me nothing in that moment. I read the letter 3 times. And then I did something I had never done before in 40-something years of navigating this relationship. I wrote back before I had decided whether I was going to go back. I wrote carefully. I wrote slowly, over the course of an evening, with more honesty than I had ever put into a communication with my mother in my entire life. I told her that I loved her. I told her that the silence had not been punishment, it had been survival. I told her that I could not continue in a relationship where the consequence for having a position different from hers was to be told not to contact my family. I told her that I wanted to find a way forward genuinely, but that the way forward had to look different from the way back. That it required her to be willing to hear me, not just to forgive me, and that those were not the same thing. I sent the letter. And then I waited. What happened next is still in motion. I want to be honest about that too. This is not a story with a clean ending, a reconciliation fully achieved, a parent transformed by consequence into someone new, a family remade on different terms. Real families don't tend to work that way. Change in long-established dynamics is slow and nonlinear and frequently disappointing and occasionally, in small increments, real. My mother called 2 days after receiving the letter. The call was different. Not entirely different. She is still herself, and herself is not a simple or uncomplicated thing. But different in the way that something shifts when a person has genuinely been made to feel the weight of what their absence might actually mean. She did not issue conditions. She did not immediately redirect the conversation toward her own feelings. She listened for longer than she usually does. And at the end of the call, after a long silence, she said something she had never said to me before in exactly these words. She said, "I know I'm not easy." That was it. 3 words that fell short of everything I had needed to hear, but were more than I had ever heard before. I held them carefully. I did not perform more gratitude than they warranted. But I held them. We are talking now. Carefully, with much more distance than before, less frequent contact, more deliberate terms, my own needs present in the equation in a way they have not historically been. My father has started texting me separately small things, which I think is his own quiet way of recalibrating. My brother and I have had one real conversation long overdue, in which I told him things about my experience of our family that he had not understood because no one had ever said them to him directly. He is processing. I am giving him time. I am not the person I was before the text arrived. That is the most important thing I can tell you. Not because the experience made me harder or more defended or more convinced that family is a lost cause. It made me none of those things. It made me more precisely myself. More certain of what I need, more practiced in the articulation of it, more grounded in the knowledge that I can survive the loss of approval and emerge on the other side still intact, still whole, still capable of love. The 58 missed calls taught me something that no amount of therapy or self-help or intellectual understanding could have taught me as directly or as completely. They taught me that my boundaries have power, that holding them, at cost, changes the dynamic in ways that yielding never does. That the people who tell you they never want to hear from you again will often, when you take them at their word, discover very quickly that they were wrong, and that this discovery is more valuable for the relationship than any capitulation you could have offered. The text said, "Don't contact us again." I listened. I gave them exactly what they asked for, and in doing so, I changed the only thing that actually needed to change, which was the terms on which contact was possible. I am not done with my family. I have never wanted to be done with them. What I wanted, what I have always wanted, is a real relationship, one where I exist in it as a full person rather than a managed presence, where my love is not contingent on my compliance, where the price of belonging is not the ongoing surrender of myself. I don't know yet if I will get that. I am cautiously, realistically, stubbornly hopeful. What I know, sitting here on the other side of all of it, is this. That Tuesday evening in February when I read the text and felt the ground beneath my feet and decided, quietly and without drama, that I was done performing the expected response, that was the most important moment of my adult life. Not the 58 calls. Not the letter. Not even the conversation where my mother said, "She knows she isn't easy." The moment I chose myself, simply and finally and without apology, and stood there in my kitchen and felt what it was like to be solid inside my own life. That moment belongs to me. And no one is getting it back. If you are reading this and recognizing your own family in any of it, the oscillation, the ultimatums, the exhaustion that lives in the body before it lives in the mind, I want you to know your need for a relationship that doesn't cost you yourself is not a character flaw. It is not ingratitude.
It is not cruelty.
It is the most basic and legitimate thing a person can ask for. The calls will come. Hold the line long enough to find out what you're made of. You may surprise yourself.